Okay, everybody, we're going to reconvene for the first of our two panel sessions. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Baroness Hayman, who will chair this session, looking at the country offer we think Labour should be making. Obviously, Lord Manderson has given us a fantastic platform to start with, and I suspect we'll have to snaffle some of his suggestions and ideas as well. But our colleague from the steering group, Ant Reid, is going to present the sort of summation of the work that we've been doing with the network, with our community, town and parish collective, and play that in for our collective consideration. So over to you, Sue.
Hello, hi everybody. As Hoyle has just said, we're going to be discussing Labour's country offer. The Labour Coast and Country group have recently come up with some proposals around that, as have the Cooperative Party. We've had a commission recently, which I was involved with, and we've also published our proposals for the kinds of things that Labour could be doing as its country offer. So we've got a great panel for you to discuss this. First of all, we have Alex Norris, who is a Member of Parliament, was until recently part of the Levelling Up team, and has now decided to join the Home Office team as the policing shadow minister. So welcome to Alex. We also have another Alex Myers, so that could be interesting when we come to discussions. The Alex will be fighting over who's going to answer the questions when I call on Alex. Alex was a former MEP and does a lot of work on animal welfare and countryside issues, so it's great to see Alex here. And also Colin Smythe, who's an MSP in South Scotland, so it's really good to get the Scottish perspective as well on these issues. But before we get to our panel discussion, I'd like to hand over to Ant Reid, Councillor Ant Reid, who is going to introduce the Coast and Country's proposals for Labour's policies. Over to you, Ant.
Sure, yes. I believe we've got a slide that we can show as well. What we're thinking about in terms of the country element of Coast and Country is in terms of people, places and purpose. So we've got to be thinking in terms of people, we've got to be thinking in terms of devolved control over housing, building on some of the successes that have happened in terms of rural exception sites, neighbourhood planning, things like that. There are some things that some parishes, towns and boroughs, they can do, and we need to just build on that and try and work out what is it that the country, the rural, those communities need. Also on economy. Again, we've got registers for community assets, things like that. We can try and defend local pubs, shops, post offices. More than that, what about jobs? Not just farming jobs. You know, jobs in the rural areas aren't all around agriculture. There's lots of economy stuff we can do. And the people that know that best are the people that live there, not necessarily the people in the cities. Places. Connectivity is more than just physical, it's digital as well. So getting those gigabit connections through, but also say cycling routes between villages and towns, so you don't die on the A34 when you're trying to get to work or go visit granny. And you've got to have an idea around how to get to those places that are between places. So you don't just drive a road from a city to a city. What about town to town? What about village to village? And then county-based transport strategies, they're all around connecting those big urban areas. Let's try and get those. We hear time and again, why can't we just cycle down the canal? Why can't we just promote some sort of rural thing along rivers and things like that? And then that's useful for all sorts of people. And then what we've been hearing also is that some services are discretionary, but they're vital for countryside communities. Think about post-16 kids trying to get to college. Not allowed on the school bus anymore. There aren't any other buses. Some things are vital for countryside communities. Let's think through policy. Let's think through how can we recognise that, and how can we make sure that rural areas have the same chances? Because people, places and purpose, the problems are probably very familiar to those that live in cities. The solutions, however, need to be quite distinctive. And that's where we look at purpose. We look at innovation in local government. What can we do about digitising the ability of parish councils to meet? What do we do about strengthening local councils so they have duties and rights to do things, and how do we build those connected communities? I was out door knocking on a village with 5 houses in it last night, and they were all really friendly, never had anyone knock on their door before. They had no idea there was a local community forum going on in the nearest town. They love the idea that we're reaching out to them. They're not connected. Half of them weren't even on Facebook, but they get the local paper, they listen to the local radio, they want to be connected. So how can we improve our offering to country communities? That's just tease you all up for answering the questions that maybe you didn't know you were going to answer. So panel, good luck with either meeting these or talking around these, or just use this as a framework. This is what we're hearing from our network of people.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting introduction. I'm sure it's given people a lot of food for thought. I think from my perspective, where I live in Cumbria, things like transport and how you connect communities are particularly relevant. Perhaps before we go over to questions, please do put your questions in the chat. I'll go around each of the panelists just for some sort of comments to start the discussion. So perhaps Alex Norris, I'll come to you first.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks all for having me. I think I was initially booked in my previous guys doing levelling up type activities with you, Sue. As you know, we had a really great session last year at the conference, so I'm really grateful to be kept on the agenda, because I think with regards to policing and crime, which is my new responsibility, I think that this is still a crucial issue. I think there's people on this call can be very proud of the work they've done over a very difficult period of time of keeping the flame going for Labour, and Sue, you're one of those people. But I look at Alex, David Ward, many others who kept that seat on the town council, or kept that 1 or 2 seats on the council, being a voice for Labour and for an alternative way. But now, hopefully, we're showing that there are no-go areas, and I think particularly that's true on crime. A nearly quarter increase of the effect of rural crime, whether that's fuel, vehicles, livestock. These are very live issues. We know the impact of antisocial behaviour on coastal communities. So for me, it's us having a really prominent and strong agenda that cuts very well in those communities around having visible local policing, which again, I know in many towns and villages is something very much of the past, but our commitment for 13,000 extra police and police community support officers, so that there's a named person in every town and village that you can go to. I think that's a really important banner commitment. As you would always expect me to say, retail crime is a particular priority for me personally, but also for us generally, and that is something that's cutting in our rural and coastal communities. We're seeing 850 incidents every day of shop workers facing violence and abuse. Again, having a better offender-focused approach to tackling that, having neighbourhood policing in there that knows their communities, can form those relationships. That's at the core of our offer. So, we're in this kind of upbeat period and set out, I think, a series of really important points to hear, further input from colleagues on the call today. Hopefully, I've added a bit of a shape of what crime what our crime and policing elements can look like too. I've managed to do the short version, which is a minor miracle, but very, very keen to hear from colleagues about what the nature of policing is like in their communities, what people are saying to them on the doorstep, and what they'd like to see from us in our offer. Cheers, Sue.
Thanks, Alex. A lot to think about. I mean, rural crime is a real problem, and we simply don't have enough rural police officers either, which adds to the issues. Alex, Maya, do you want to come in on your thoughts on the presentation?
Great, thank you, Sue. So I think I'm here mainly in my role as on the National Policy Forum. So I thought I'd give you a brief sort of flavour of what happened at that event. I know many of you were there, including Alex Norris, who was busy trying to make me sign away amendments and things like that late into the night. So I think one of the things about the National Policy Forum is obviously it brings together people from right across the Labour movement, but it sometimes can feel a little bit more urban dominated, because you've got all of the big trade union bosses there. You've got a lot of the Labour front bench there who at the moment tend to be in more urban areas. So it was particularly important that we got across the voices and concerns of Labour members who lived in more rural and countryside areas. And actually the work we did in the build-up to the NPF was really important, because actually you don't want to be having lots of last minute amendments really at the final stage of it. What you want to do is the detailed work that Hewell and others led on to make sure that actually we'd already begun to kind of rural and country proof those documents. I think the three themes that came out to me that really mattered to our members was firstly about housing, particularly in those coastal communities, the issues of second home ownership, particularly about broadband. It really matters in today's society. Having really good broadband in more rural areas is so important. So much of today's life is done online, but also actually making sure that people have got the opportunities to use it. I saw a statistic the other day about just how many job interviews are now done on Teams and on Zoom, and making sure that people are able to log into those with good broadband, but also actually with the equipment to be able to access it too. And finally, about transport. And there, I think it's really important that we look to the future, not just the past. I mean, we did have a lot of rural buses under the last Labour government. I worry that quite a lot of them trundled around the countryside empty. And actually making sure that we make the most of the technology that we've got. So thinking about more demand responsive services, thinking about kind of setting up a publicly controlled Uber kind of service for the countryside is the kind of thing that the Labour Party that's really focused on the future could really get behind.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alex. Colin, can I now come to you for your thoughts on the presentation?
Thanks very much indeed, everyone. And first of all, it's great to have a Scottish voice here this morning. Can I begin with a little plug? It's a big week for the party across the UK right here in Scotland, with a certain by-election taking place in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Now, it's not quite rural Scotland, but if you do want to come up and campaign, you will pass through the most beautiful part of rural Scotland, my South Scotland region, which are all more than welcome to come along to. And this by-election is important because we know there's no road back to a Labour government that doesn't lead through Scotland, and that actually includes many rural constituencies such as the Western Isles and East Lothian are really vital to getting that majority and getting Keir into number 10. So our rural communities are hugely important for that victory. But for me, they absolutely strike at the very heart of our values as a party. If you look at the issues that land in my inbox every single day, it's the very issues that Labour should be challenging. Low pay, here in Dumfries and Galloway in the south of Scotland, it is the lowest paid region in the whole country. The cost of living crisis is really hammering families in this area. We have the highest levels of fuel poverty. The real challenges of access to public services such as health are more acute in our rural communities, as most people on the conference today will know. You cannot register with an NHS dentist here in Dumfries and Galloway at the moment, and you have very little chance of finding social carers. At present, we have the highest levels of delayed discharge in our hospitals, and that recruitment is more difficult in our rural communities than it is anywhere else. So if you look at those issues that Labour should be championing, they are more acute, as most people will know, in our rural communities. That's why that future offer that we have as a party is so important to those rural areas. The final comment I'd make is that I suppose one of the messages that's certainly coming across from your presentation, and is one that I get every day, is that our rural communities often do feel forgotten, and that's from all political parties. And sometimes there's a perception that, well, it's different in Scotland because you have devolution. Well, I can tell you, families in the south of Scotland feel as remote from government in Edinburgh as they feel as remote from government in Westminster as well. And we have to reach out to those communities, win them back, because it's vital to a Labour government, but it's actually vital to the very values that we stand for as a party.
Thank you very much, Colin. And can I just come to you before we move on to questions, just if you've got any broad responses or comments on the issues that have been raised by the panelists.
So it fits in very much with what we've been hearing. Policing, it's not just a rural problem or an urban problem, but the solutions need to be distinctively rural in the rural areas. Villages that are 45 minutes from the nearest police station are not going to get good policing. Social care, healthcare, doctors. You do hear this in the cities, you do hear this in the large towns, but so it's the same problem, but we need a unique solution for a countryside area. We need to think more innovatively and creatively. Otherwise, these people are just going to get left behind and can't live in the countryside sometimes, have to move to a town to get the care they need. And Alex, getting the attention of predominantly urban front benchers. Try doing that as a rural councillor in an urban council as well. I mean, that maps down to every level, but it's cyclical, isn't it? We got to be relevant to the rural areas if they're going to trust us with their vote. And until we get elected people from rural areas, that voice will be missing. And Labour Coast and Country is really the area that's our focus. That's what we're trying to do, is to promote the voice of these areas. So yeah, really glad to hear some of those ideas kicking around, some of those solutions are starting to be formulated, but it's difficult.
Thanks, and I've been looking through some of the questions. One that's jumped out at me is around access to banking. This is something we've been discussing during the passage of the Levelling Up Bill, the loss of banks, post offices, financial services, cash points in market towns and even villages where sometimes you had them. And so with this, it's one area that we, as a Labour Party in the Lords, have passed an amendment on to try and get something done about this. I'd just be interested to hear panellists' thoughts on the importance of access to financial services, perhaps what Labour should be doing about that. Perhaps Alex Mayer, I could come to you first on this one, if you've got any thoughts.
Thank you, Sue. I mean, that is the problem of when goes village, that's it. So when a cash point disappears in a more urban area, you can go to another one locally. But if a cash point, if a post office disappears in a village, you're a long way away from the next one. I think it also feeds into some of the other things that we've been discussing around good access to broadband and good access to transport, because actually the solution that the bank would say to you is, well, you know, the vast majority of transactions are now done online. Well, that's all well and good if you've got excellent broadband. But as we also know, we've got the same problem of people living in those more remote communities. They're also more likely to be in one of those broadband not spots, and therefore it's much harder to do so. Also, frankly, you can't always get mobile signals to be ringing up your bank to be doing the telephone banking as well. And then it also feeds into those issues of transport as well. One of the policies that Labour Coast and Country has long advocated is that when you've got less access to transport, to broadband, to facilities within your own community, we should have an equal policy that gives you access to one of those things. So, for example, if you lose connectivity in terms of transport, you should be prioritised to connectivity in terms of broadband. And I think that's something that we can think about in terms of making sure that community is retained in rural communities as well.
That's really, really interesting point. That's tied together with the broadband issues. Colin, do you have any thoughts around that, around the broadband and banking and how it all could be improved?
Absolutely. I mean, I spend an unhealthy amount of my time at the moment phoning businesses to ask if they're interested in taking on the post office, because the one round the corner has just closed, and it's happening almost every week at the moment. And I think when it comes to banking, we do need to look at regulation around where that bank is the last bank in the town or in the village, and having, I think, a more robust process before it closes. But I think one of the innovations, and ironically, that one of the pilot schemes is in Rutherglen, is around hubs, those banking hubs that are being taken forward. I think there are pilot schemes, but frankly, we need to be rolling that out far more than we are at the moment. Those hubs at the moment are led by the post office, but they obviously include banks working from there, potentially one bank one day a week, another bank the next day a week, all in a central hub. I think we need to be looking at that solution and driving that more. Because it's not just about banking services and post offices, it's about other services as well, that even local authorities are having to pull back on. The old town halls and village halls are closing because of cuts. Those central hubs that bring those services together, I think we need to be looking at rolling those out a lot more in our towns and in our villages, because they do provide a solution in terms of reducing costs, but also making sure those services are there when people need them.
Thanks, Colin. And I saw you nodding away. Did you want to come in with any comments?
Absolutely. Banking hubs, we've been looking at that locally here as well. They're a brilliant idea, poorly financed by the private sector, poorly regulated, poorly defined. The rollout has stalled. It's a typical half-assed approach to a good idea. And we need some competent government, some competent leadership to get these ideas. They're not political. They're not party political. They're just get on with it. Like so much that's been going on, not going on for the last decade or so.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question. If Alex Norris, I could come to you on this. One of the questions is quite interesting. It's around how the deprivation index is calculated. And what the questioner says is that the index is skewed towards high density communities. And of course, in a rural area, you don't tend to have that. And often I found, certainly in the work I've done, that often rural poverty is actually very hidden. So how do we tackle that? How do we get a better understanding of rural poverty and deprivation?
Thanks, Sue, and thank you for that question and comment. I think that's something that teams through the Levelling Up agenda, that actually pockets of deprivation, or even quite big areas of deprivation, exist in all parts of the country, but can be masked, especially if you start to pull out quite a long way. If you pull out to a county level, never mind, if you go beyond even the district, you can really lose what are very challenged communities that not only have significant socioeconomic challenges, but also don't then have the assets in all the ways that we've heard that we would usually point at towards them. I mean, that the point on the IMD, that's a new one for me. I mean, I think what we are very clear as a party and a group of people looking to form the next government, we know that the kind of thumb on the scale approach to regional investment, where you give it to your mates or you have a party political interpretation of where money should go, that has failed, and that always will fail. And that's not why we seek to lead, in order to just say, well, they've had their few years, it's now our few years. Actually, what you need is a really cold and honest look at where need is, where deprivation is, those compounding factors that perhaps get missed. And I always think for coastal communities, the impact of being at the end of the line, the impact of being communities where maybe they were the last happy memories for people in cities like mine, so they move out to Skegness and then bring often some of their challenges with them, bring that extra need for support. So I think it's important that what we've got, what the bedrock of that kind of analytical frame that we use is a solid one, so that then your public policy decisions are fair and equitable ones. So very happy to look at that because that was new to me to hear, but I will certainly be looking at that.
Thanks very much, Alex. Alex made just on the same issue. I mean, one of the comments in the chat is about how it's much more difficult when you're isolated in rural communities. And obviously, you talked about broadband and connectivity. How else do you think? I mean, I'm thinking from the National Policy Forum and other discussions. How do we combat that issue of isolation?
Thanks, Sue. I think there was a think tank, Onwards, I think, did some work about the fact that there are hidden pockets of deprivation in some of our more rural areas because of the way that formulas are calculated. For example, I mean, in places like Bath and North East Somerset Council, you can imagine that Bath, relatively prosperous area completely masks the fact that you've actually got old mining areas, places like Radstock, that you know, if you plonked them up in the north, would look like a traditional mining town, and they're, you know, literally 2 or 3 miles away from a historic city like Bath. And those factors are really lost, and you do need to be able to drill down. And with all today's, you know, amazing technology, we really ought to be able to kind of get at that data and really make a difference like that. How do you make people, and how do you build community, I suppose is the question, isn't it? No, I actually think that if you look around many villages, there is a real sense of community. I think some of the work that Labour Coast and Country does through our parish network of town and parish councillors really shows that there are people who want to get involved in their communities, and there's a whole host of different activities happening there. The difficulty is that you can have these kind of small kind of, I suppose, hubs of activity happening in different places. It's about connecting them up more widely, because quite often they're facing exactly the same problems in one parish and the next parish, but trying to make sure that we've got some kind of collective action and learning and sharing best practice and ideas is something that Labour Coast and Country has been certainly think town and parish councillors from across the country, but it's also something that local communities themselves want to do, to find out about similar challenges and indeed opportunities, and work out what they can do to make their communities thrive. I also think that people are inherently proud of the places that they live, and the Labour Party doesn't need to always be talking about the problems there. Most people think that where they live is a good place to live, and they want to celebrate it. So we need to give people the tools to be able to do that, so that we look like, and indeed are actually in touch with those communities that we represent and seek to represent in the future.
Thanks, Alex. It's an interesting discussion about, and it's in the chat as well, about, you know, do we need to be empowering town and parish councils? I mean, I should probably declare an interest. My husband's chair of our parish council, so I think they do a lot of work that's probably not recognised. I just wonder, Colin, if your thoughts on that. Obviously, in Scotland, you have community councils rather than parish councils, but obviously you've got the same issues. Would empowering those that lowest tier of government, if you like, help support local communities more?
It absolutely would, Sue. Partly because we've actually seen, ironically, since devolution, a huge centralisation in Scotland to the Scottish Parliament and to Edinburgh. Local authorities have seen a far more significant cut to their budgets than other services in Scotland. So, you know, we often say that the Scottish government have taken austerity from the current UK government, and they've trebled it when it comes to passing on the cuts to local government. So they've seen a disproportionate amount of cuts to their services, and lots of powers taken away to Edinburgh effectively by the Scottish government. So in many ways, we need to actually address that and return powers to our local authorities a lot more than they have. And there's a lot of work taking place within the party in Scotland on that. You know, should we be looking at, I suppose, mayoral systems for some of our towns and communities, not just when it comes to our big cities? Because I made the point earlier that a lot of our rural communities in the Highlands Islands here in the south of Scotland do feel as if they're further away from government in Edinburgh since devolution, and that's really, really frustrating. So we do need to empower our local authorities more, because we may be a relatively small nation, but actually the diversity across Scotland is very significant, from our islands to our market towns, and there has been that centralisation, and it has led to that feeling that often our rural communities are very much forgotten. So it is about passing powers on areas like economic development and others down to our local authorities, which at the moment are often centralised in Scotland to organisations such as Scottish Enterprise.
Thank you. Thanks, Colin. Can I move to Ant now? And I'll start a different issue. There's a question just come in about the sustainability of small schools and ageing populations in many kind of rural areas. And this is particularly around Cambridgeshire, but I know we have the same problem in Cumbria. I'm sure we have in many other areas. I just wondered, Ant, if you had any thoughts, if that had come up in discussions about how you keep those small village schools going.
Yes, it's It's a difficult one. So the local community needs to define what it wants for its local village. We need to give them the power to be able to say, I want some small growth for starter homes, or do I want bungalows for an aging population? What do I want in my local area? And then the school's survival just depends on that. If you have larger schools, you tend to get more resources. There's an economy of scale there. But smaller schools really help a community keep itself together, keep its ethos, its feel, its history, its sense of community together. So one idea that's been mooted around is rural exception sites. So a parish council can add on to a settlement boundary and say, this area here is for starter homes so that small families can have kids. That allows the school to have enough people to survive. And it's a difficult one, but I do think the important thing here is to have the local communities involved in deciding what the future is for their community for the next 20 to 50 years. Small schools are part of that. Do they want the schools, or do they want a community centre for coffee lounges on a Sunday morning, and the kids go to the nearby town? They've got to be involved in that conversation, and currently they're not.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Good point. Alex Norris, I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, or how schools could be used more widely as community hubs, or even for adult education. There was a question about adult education earlier. How do you support schools more widely?
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw the adult education one pop up, and hopefully might have a chance at that. I mean, I'll link this again to what a couple of panelists have said, and people from the audience have said about, at the moment, our parliamentary party is predominantly and significantly so urban, and frankly there's no community more urban than mine, and there's no community less coastal than mine, and it's better to be honest about those things. But part of that is, we've been at a low ebb, and that we hope to change in significant proportions in the next year. But also we should look to our metro mayors in that, because actually, again, for the highly city-based mayors, perhaps less so, but you look at South Yorkshire, Ollie Coppard, Dan Norris, no namesake but no relation, no need to declare an interest. They are already people who are speaking and setting public policy for rural communities. And whether that's on public transport, or whether particularly in this case around that greater control of local skills budgets, that can have a more tailored offer. Much better to have a mayor like Dan setting the adult education policy than it is from Whitehall, because you can get down granularly to that town and village to say, well, what is the location on what day, and how are we going to make sure that those resources are there. So I think we should really see greater devolution as an empower of that, and that, as I always bang on about, that devolution is not a process that stops at the combined authority level, that we're seeing devolution to our councils and our all the way to our towns and parishes as well, so that more of those decisions, and exactly the way Ant said, that often are decisions between things, not a binary would you like better services or not, but which of these are your priorities, that you'll get much better decision making if not only are local people in the room, but frankly local people are making the decisions.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Colin, that kind of ties into one of the questions around tackling the skills gap. And you talked about the difficulty of encouraging people to come and work in local rural communities, and retention of people because of the lack of services. I just wondered, how do we tackle that skills gap? How do we grow our own, if you like, as well?
I think that's a really important point, Sue. I mean, the outward migration of young people from our region was actually the reason I stood for Parliament. I was a teacher. I remember speaking to a class in Stranraer Academy, and I asked, what do you want, the 6-year class, what do you want to do when you get to the end of this year? And more than half said they wanted to leave Stranraer. They were heading to the cities because that's where the high-paid, high-quality jobs were. And we have a huge problem with the outward migration of young people moving away from the area. So it's about making sure, first of all, that we've got those high quality, well-paid jobs more evenly distributed across Scotland. And new technology means there is no barrier to that, as there maybe it would have been some years ago. We need to look at things like civil service jobs moving out of the cities into our rural communities, because change in technology means that's entirely practical. It's about making sure we have the jobs for young people to go to, and then making sure that our agencies that provide that skills training are actually tailoring that to rural communities. Too often the solutions they have around apprenticeship schemes in Scotland, for example, through Skills Development Scotland, are very much targeted at big businesses that might want to take on 10, 12, 13 apprentices, when in fact it's about the small business that taking on one apprentice is a massive step for them, because it could be 20% of their workforce, 30% of their workforce, and we need to tailor the packages of support to small businesses in our rural communities and make sure that they are rural friendly when it comes to those support. Properly funding our colleges to take account of the fact that you won't have 40 people in a class in a rural college. You may have 5 or 10 people doing, I don't know, marine engineering in Stranraer, but that will make a massive difference to that community. Support rural colleges take account of the fact that it is more expensive to provide these courses in our rural areas, because at the moment we're not delivering for the businesses and the communities when it comes to how we actually fund and support our colleges. So it is about tailoring the training that actually meets the challenges of rural communities in terms of numbers and in terms of access.
Thank you, Colin. We've had a comment that that what we need to do is demonstrate what Labour councillors in rural areas, mayors, PCCs, where we have them in rural areas, how do we demonstrate? How do we show people, what they have achieved? Perhaps, I don't know, Alex Mayer, you could perhaps make some comments on that.
Well, I'm afraid the answer is to knock on doors, isn't it, and tell people all about it, and to deliver leaflets and all the many things that our parliamentary candidates were talking about earlier. So we have to shout about the difference that Labour in power makes, because nobody else is going to do it for us. Within our rural areas as well, I think an underutilised resource is the Parish Council magazine. Now, the moment that you have got the word councillor in front of your name, or mayor in front of your name, they will publish stuff about you. It won't be overtly party political, but month in, month out, you can have a little report about the stuff that you are doing. And I think that plays into what we were talking about in the last session with Peter Mandelson about not appearing weird. It means that you really do become part of the community, and you're relaying important, useful information to people. And that is a really, really important campaigning technique. Also, we have been talking about devolution. I do think it's important to make sure that we have, as a Labour Party, have a kind of power where power best sits model. It doesn't always need to be about changing up kind of and down through all of the gears. It doesn't have to go Whitehall and then, to a combined authority and then maybe to a unitary and then to a parish. There are powers that could be devolved direct from government to a parish council. We don't have to go through all the bits in between, but it's also about making sure that we consolidate some powers where they need to be as well, because I think, for example, of our transport system in some regions, you can have a situation where the bus stop is looked after by the parish council, the district council is in charge of all of the highways and the roads on which your bus runs. You've got a devolved mayor who's theoretically in charge of transport policy altogether and is the transport authority, and then you've got every key route looked after by Highways England. That is not any kind of recipe for an efficient, good transport system. So sometimes consolidating power in different places is important to get stuff done, and then we can carry on showing the difference that Labour makes in power.
Thanks, Alex. Alex Norris, have you got any other comments you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, I think there's, part of this is the media catching up on it. Part of it is us in our communications catching up on it. The most important, and this can cut both ways, but the most important kind of advocates for a future Labour government across the UK is the work that we do in Wales already and trumpeting those achievements, the work that our mayors are doing and trumpeting those achievements, the work that our councils are. So we have to, a lot of the conversation gets stuck in the media saying, well, what would you do about what the government is doing on this one thing today? Is that right or wrong? And, you know, to a degree, you can't avoid that entirely, but you have to get off that to say that actually all over the country, really exciting things are happening. I think that, you know, depending, if we don't get an election in May and we go into this time next year, well, I would feel very optimistic that we will be picking up new mayors across the country in May. We'll be regaining lots of police and crime commissioners across the country. And again, they will have, it'll only be, you know, the first 5 to 6 months, but a record of getting things done. And in an election where, you know, at the moment, and you know, people on this call all speak to people on the doorstep, there's this sense of frustration that nothing gets better, it's always bad news, there's never anything positive. Well, actually, we will have a boatload of stories of people who've hit the ground running and, you know, addressed local issues, and it'll be early days, they won't, you know, solved all their problems, but something to really hang our hat on. And we need to make sure we get away from that kind of, you know, Westminster square mile mindset and into that, you know, rest of you know, across the UK.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's also been some interesting comments in the chat about how we could use local papers better and more effectively as well, press releases and writing letters and so on. Can I come to Ant now? There was a comment in the chat about encouraging tenant farmers to take on apprentices as an option. I think we should actually be looking about how we can support tenant farmers, encouraging new people to come into tenant farming. One of those the issues around that is of course leases, length of lease to tenant farmers, the issue around the loss of county farms. I just wondered if Ant had got any thoughts about that and what we could be doing as a party to encourage that.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem with talent farming is there's a lot of chaos going on in the agricultural industry at the moment. Supply chain, demand chaos, all sorts of things. People are starting to look at solar farms and housing developments, just a reliable way to change what they do. So what future is there in farming? Obviously, there's a future. We want food security. We want a good range of food. We don't want massive farms. So we need to promote this. One of the answers is through the colleges, making sure that, you know, farming and the farm technologies, the farm sciences is part of what we offer in those colleges that are always in the towns. But another one is promoting all the schemes, whether it's work placement from schools, as well as apprenticeships, as well as different ways of encouraging youngsters to come from towns to countryside, as well as stay in the countryside. But then, like I say, it's all connected. Where do they live? Can they afford to live in a rural area where it's $500,000 for a new house on an income that an apprentice would get? It's a hard one. And I do think it involves Labour and whoever's in charge of the local area to start to solve some of the problems, reduce some of the factors that make it harder for tenant farmers to be there. And then to connect to local markets, to connect to local food supply chains, to connect to an opportunity to then sell what you do, not just through supermarkets, but through the local community as well, which means some sort of economic control by the district council of its local area so that it can do that. It's a big thing, but I think it's going to take new thinking, distinctive thinking, because it's a purely rural issue. But it mirrors a lot of the problems that you get in the towns and the cities, with apprenticeships all being devalued because they're just cheap labour. And we want it to be building real skills that are needed for the future of the industry, not the past.
Thanks, Ant. Colin, of course, agriculture's devolved in Scotland, but I'm sure you have many of the similar challenges. So I just wondered if you had any comments about that, and also the issue around actually affordable housing as well. Where do people live?
Absolutely. I mean, you know yourself, but as much as anybody, being in Cumbria, Sue, that often recruitment's a challenge for businesses, and sometimes people are happy to come to the area to take up that job, but they can't because they can't find the house in those local communities. And it's not the 300 houses in the town of Dumfries where I am, it's the 5 or 6 houses in the village nearby that actually makes it more accessible for them to get to the job that are lacking. And it's about making sure that we're investing in those communities to have those small pockets of housing. But you're right, agriculture is obviously hugely important. In Scotland, 80% of our land is under agricultural production, and it does create around £3 billion a year for the economy, and there are hundreds of thousands of jobs affected by it. One of the big challenges we have in Scotland at the moment is that, unlike the rest of the UK, the government have still not set out what future agricultural support will be post-Brexit. It's remarkable that 6 years since the referendum on the EU, the government have still not set out what that future support mechanisms will look like. We're still effectively working towards implementing CAP as we currently look at. And what that means for farmers is there's huge uncertainty out there. At the moment, they don't know whether to invest in their farm, they don't know what the future means for their families, and very often that succession isn't there because families are not taking the farm on because they are worried about the future and that lack of direction. So what we need to do here in Scotland is absolutely set out that future direction for farming in Scotland. The mechanisms will be different from England because we do have a lot of land that isn't is difficult to farm on. So direct support for production still needs to be a key part of the agricultural support we give. But at the moment, the government are falling way behind in Scotland, setting up what that support should look like, whether you're a tenant farmer, a crofter, or you own your farm. And that is a real problem for agriculture at the moment.
That's great. Thanks very much, Colin. We've literally just got a few minutes left now. So perhaps if I can just go around the panel, just to ask for literally 30 seconds, few final comments and thoughts. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you. Alex Norris, we come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should take a lot of optimism from the conversations that we've just had and that we're having throughout the day, you know, that we can be very confident in asserting that we are a country that seeks to lead all communities across the UK, that we're bubbling with ideas. Obviously, for me, I'm particularly interested in issues relating to community safety, but we've covered all range of it. It's our job now to translate that so that when we're sat in a year's time, we might be talking about what we could be doing in government. That's an exceptionally exciting opportunity. So we've got to get our ideas together as we've been doing through the MPF. That'll get through to a manifesto process, but it's time to get out there. It's time to win those seats and time to win government.
Alex, Mayor?
Yep, thanks, Sue. Yeah, it's always fantastic to hear from the many different views of people from right across the country. We've got to make sure that we have an election winning manifesto, and that means that we've got to make sure it speaks to people in urban areas, in rural areas, right across the country. Because winning matters. We can see the difference that councillors make at the moment, Labour councillors when they're in power, but just think how much difference we can make when we've got a Labour government as well.
That's great. Colin.
I mean, one of my messages, I think we need to be confident about what Labour stands for. I mean, as a politician in Scotland, we've had some pretty tough times over the last few years, to say the least, with just one MP. Now we're in a place where polls are showing that we are on the way back. And I think too often we can look at some of our rural communities and think, well, Labour's not on the pitch in those areas. Well, actually, we need to get on the pitch. We need to be confident about that positive policy offer in those rural communities to tell people that this is what Labour stands for and the difference it will make in those communities in a way that maybe we've not been able to do in recent years in Scotland because it has been so difficult. So be confident, get out into those communities, because those communities need a Labour government more than anywhere else in the country, because they're often the ones that have been left behind, in my case, by two governments that are out of touch, a Conservative government in Westminster and an SNP government in Edinburgh. And it's time to put that alternative to our rural communities of a positive Labour government, both across the UK, but also here in Scotland.
Thank you. And your thoughts following your presentation.
It's a plug, really. We have a network of community, parish and town councillors. Join our WhatsApp group, sign up on our website, follow the QR code that comes up here every now and then, exchange these ideas, these problems, form that community. Don't wait another year and listen to people talking to you. Don't try and talk just to government, talk to each other. It's that grassroots connection that I think will solve a lot of these problems, will prove out some of these ideas, and will help Labour be more successful in these rural areas, community, town and parish. Join the Captain Network.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I mean, we've covered a lot of topics: rural crime, housing, transport, issue of financial services, isolation, education and the future of rural schools, as well as connectivity, particularly around broadband, and the challenges facing our farmers, particularly our tenant farmers at the moment. I do think, though, that what has come across really strongly is that we have a huge opportunity to actually win rural seats for Labour at the next general election, whether that's in England, Wales or Scotland. Rural communities, I door knock a lot, as I'm sure everyone does. A lot of them are absolutely sick to the back teeth of the Tories. But when you go out door knocking, often they don't know who to vote for, which gives us a huge opportunity. And as people have said, we need to speak to people living in the countryside. Our manifesto needs to give them an offer. Many of their concerns are exactly the same as those in rural communities, but often just need to be approached in a slightly different way. So I think we have a huge opportunity. Thanks, everybody. And I'll now close this session and hand back to Hoyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you for everybody on the panel. Thank you, Anne, for collating and bringing together all the observations on some of the challenges and some of the solutions that have come out of Coast&Country's work and the Captain Network's work over the last 18 months. The Captain Network link is in the chat for those of you that are or know community, town or parish councillors who should be part of that network. We're going to form the coastal panel next. So I would like to invite Daniel Zeichner to join us, Councillor Becky Cooper, leader of Worthing Council, to join us, Dr. Pam Buchan, who's going to present the Coast&Country coastal proposition. Unfortunately, Steve Bassam has had a family clash, so he's had to go and do that, and we're all perfectly understanding of family clashes. One thing that's absolutely true of what we're about to face in the next 18 months is candidates and the people who support and work with them being worked very hard. And if you can't help them on the campaign trail, then perhaps you can help them just in terms of their day-to-day life and keeping on top of things. And that's also why Annalise can't join us today. She was canvassing on the South Coast. She'd hoped to dial in for this panel, but she's been called away at the relatively last minute notice. But we will get a chance to play back what we've talked about here, what Pam is about to present, as well as the clips earlier from Lord Mandelson and from Anne's presentation. One last thought, it's quite possible, I've been told, the Mayor of the West of England, Dan Norris, might join us for this panel, and if he makes it in, we look forward to joining it. In fact, he's just about to come in the room too. So I will let him in, and Joey, perhaps you can add him to this little collective that we've got in front of us. Thank you very much, Jan, for joining us. The shortest notice possibly I've ever given anybody for joining a panel, about 38 seconds. It's very kind. Pam, would you like to, and I know there are slides that will sort of form a backdrop to this, would you like to take us through Labour Coast&Country's coastal proposition? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Huel. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Pamela Buchan and I'm one of the Labour Coast&Country directors and the coastal lead. I live in southwest Devon, just on the fringes of Plymouth, and I'm a former Plymouth councillor, as well as being involved in the Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authority and shipping, and I'm a marine social scientist at Exeter. So my interest in the coast is pretty keen. So we have a strong national heritage associated with the coast that we've already been hearing about this morning, particularly from Lord Mandelson, and that attachment hasn't really been matched in policy effort and effectiveness. The geography, history and the economic and governance structures really conspire to bring around a host of social and economic challenges for the coast. So as well as the crumbling infrastructure and seasonal economies and underperforming public services, coastal communities are also at the brunt of the impacts of climate change, facing quite unique challenges in the nature of the places that people have attachments to. So for this session, there's so many different things we could do, but we've tried to pull together three key themes of infrastructure, resource and institutions. From an infrastructure perspective, the coast shares many of the challenges as we've just been discussing in terms of rural communities, such as poor digital and physical connectivity, difficulty delivering accessible public services. But at the coast, these are exacerbated by the history of how the seaside has been developed. So leaving coastal towns with unsuitable housing stock, second homes pushing locals out and pushing prices up, and some places becoming a kind of ghost town during the winter season. People living at the coast face disproportionately poor health, poor educational outcomes, And being at the fringe of the country makes it quite difficult to recruit and retain the public sector workforce that's needed to address these challenges. So at Labour Coast and Country, we believe that the combination of powers and controls and investment are needed right across government tiers. If we have locally led economic strategy, that can give a voice to the coast, and it ensures that the development is relevant and at the right community scales. We need a firm hand in housing control to deliver the right kind of homes, ensuring a minimum proportion of community homes for rent and rules around second home ownership. And we need a shift in the approach to investment in connectivity that supports people who are the most in need, rather than making decisions on the basis of cost effectiveness that penalises smaller and more remote communities. And the space here to be really radical, one suggestion that we've heard is the creation of a university of the coast that would also be for the coast. So improving access to HE for coastal communities and also supporting coastal economies. Inevitably, these sorts of ideas make us question the resourcing of what this change, how can we fund this? The local government funding formula doesn't really work. It's faced 13 years of radical cuts to the government's revenue support grant. And that's been replaced with a central financial support system of these sort of time-limited themed funds that tie the hands of local councils to really be able to deliver the projects that they know are needed and when they need them. And also being administratively difficult and possible deadlines, and then the funds being withdrawn if they're not delivered on time. On top of this backdrop, coastal towns are punished economically by having unreliable seasonal economies, and the small populations, this economy of scale that we've just been talking about, that results in small council tax receipts and often means that the cost benefit analysis doesn't really work for that community. I know that even in Plymouth as a city, we're still some tens of thousands of people short from this magic number that gives us the financial resilience that we need to thrive. So a potential solution is maybe to deliver more public sector partnerships, both with private and third sectors. One example we've been given would be greater public funding for air ambulances and the RNLI, so that we can deliver not only more secure rescue services, but also potentially reduce their A&E waiting times. We want to see reform of this funding formula so that it works better for coastal communities, reflecting their unique circumstances and enabling them to deliver what's really needed for a sustainable future. Instead of funding the national government's priorities, funding should be targeted to more place-based initiatives, embracing the diversity of place and the place identities there, and then facilitating more relevant developments, such as in the green and blue industries, supporting a more year-round economy. And Labour's done this kind of thing before. The New Deal for Communities was shown to be very effective, so we could look at repeating that kind of approach again. And that brings us to our third theme about the institutions of governance and the distribution of power within decision-making at the coast. It's very important that we hear the voices of the people who are at the coast to help us navigate decisions and how they impact on the different groups, so locals and newcomers, managing old and new industries. The Green Industrial Revolution offers this amazing sweeping economic opportunity for the coast, but only if it's delivered in the right way. If we take a top-down kind of strategic approach to that development, we risk industrialising the coast solely to serve the cities, benefits bypassing the coastal communities while their places are being changed beyond recognition. And we can already see how the kind of permissive nature of national planning law can fetter councils in making the locally relevant decisions that they want to make, and then poor consultation processes and low participation also hinders good decision-making. So we believe that more devolution is needed, done in the right way to deliver funding and power at locally relevant levels and using appropriate governance structures. It can be done badly, it can be done well. Subsidiarity gives better decision-making because it puts the powers closest to those who are going to be impacted by developments, but it has to include resources to be effective. At Labour Coast and Country, we really are champions of the town tier. You've heard that already today, and we want to see this tier reformed and strengthened to give a more robust and accessible council. And we've heard through our different engagement activities about a desire for something of a more unified coastline. So, for example, would a mayor of the South Coast work rather than the current ways that's been approached? We really need coastal coordination and decision-making so that decisions can be made at relevant geographies. So not just being tied to the administrative boundaries that we have for our councils, where there can be quite a difference between a coastal part or a big city within the same constituency or local authority area. we have the potential to be having innovation in decision-making processes. So what can we learn from existing partnership approaches? For example, the coastal partnerships can be very effective, particularly looking at more environmental challenges, but they work to bring together lots of different sectors and different stakeholders. Can we learn from these? Can we apply these in different ways? And is there a space for example, a coastal citizens assembly? We would definitely benefit from reformed consultation approaches that give a better balance of voices being heard and how different kinds of evidence can be then brought together to inform our decisions. So that's kind of a broad sweep over some of the key issues and the potential solutions that we've been hearing about and thinking about, and hopefully some food for thought for our debate.
Thank you, Pam. That was fantastic. Becky, I wonder if I could come to you first for your initial observations, and then I'd like to go Dan, if that's okay. Becky.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. And thanks, Coast&Country, for having me today. It's really interesting. Pam, that basically sums up pretty much all our problems and solutions on one slide. So that's great. Thanks very much. So just sort of maybe to give a bit more context, people may or may not know Worthing on the south coast. It's about 20 minutes west of Brighton, and most people have heard of Brighton, and directly down from London. So in many ways, it benefits from being on the south coast, and in other ways, it really doesn't at all. We are typical, I would say, of a coastal town in that we are relatively affluent because we're in the south coast, but we also have some serious indices of deprivation that are very much in line with other coastal towns. If I look at those three areas that Pam so eloquently outlined, we very much sort of align with the issues that have been raised. Housing is our number one pressure. On the coast, it's absolutely the number one pressure. And it's slightly different to Devon and Cornwall, where I know my sort of colleagues and comrades down there are going bananas about Airbnb, and that is the serious problem. For us, it's slightly less about Airbnb, and it's more about our local residents are just being priced out. So we absolutely benefit from having Brighton next door to us, but we also are now very attractive to the Brightonians and the down from Londoners, and our local residents who we absolutely want to keep and we need in order to be able to have thriving communities and to do those jobs that, you know, don't pay millions of pounds. They simply can't afford to live here. And we picked up this administration in May 2022, and the previous administration was Conservative, and it had done what many local governments had done, and had given away our housing stock, or had sold it, but essentially given it away. So we don't have any social housing here. So we are absolutely under enormous pressure. And because we're a coastal town, we're very fortunate. We've got the Channel to our south, and that brings great opportunities. And we're very fortunate we've got the South Downs National Park to our north, also a beautiful place, but we can't build houses yet in the sea. And the South Downs National Park definitely aren't keen on it. So we're actually 95% developed here, with very limited social housing. And we really do need some good government policy. Planning policy is absolutely appalling for us, and I'm sure it is for all of yourselves, whether you're rural or coastal. And we need some very intelligent planning policy reforms, and looking at sort of where the national Labour messaging is at the moment. For me, planning reforms is one of those things that won't, you know, break that economic fiscal approach, but it will bring some major benefits to our residents. So I feel very strongly about that. In terms of resource, we are, you know, as with all local governments, very, very stretched indeed. And in terms of the way funding allocation works for us, it essentially doesn't really at all. So if I think about, again, going back to housing, if I think about our local housing allowance, it's massively under where our market rent value is. And that's because of the zoning, which was done, you know, God knows how long ago. Our zoning actually takes in Littlehampton and Bognor Regis, a bit further to the west of us, which are actually more deprived areas, and the rent is considerably lower. So our poor people here trying to sort of rent something with LHA simply can't. So in terms of just that basic resource, we are absolutely stretched trying to deliver our statutory duty. Also, in terms of resources generally, I mean, it's the same as everywhere else. Levelling Up Fund, we haven't actually been successful in our bids for levelling up, and I would argue that actually levelling up really has been very unsuccessful for coastal areas. Even, as I say, my colleagues to the west of us who have got levelling up funding are finding it incredibly difficult to actually shoehorn it into the sort of resources that they need to actually access in order to improve our residents' everyday lives. revenue is really where it's at. We need to be able to deliver basic services. We need to make sure that we're emptying the bins, we're cleaning the streets, we're doing, you know, all the things that we need to do in order to be able to ease pressure for people's lives, and levelling up funding simply isn't sort of cutting it. Similarly, you know, we have the UK SPF, which the UK SPF, again, has had some limited use, but we're shoehorning our resources all the time. We're sort of thinking, okay, how do we get sustainable travel into that? How do we get the cost of living crisis into that? That simply shouldn't be the case. You know, for our coastal communities, we have very specific needs and requirements, and we need to be able to access the resources and in order to be able to sort of address them. It was interesting when you were talking about the strengthening that sort of town level. I'm sure for many of us here, that sort of sense of place, being a district and borough, has always been important, but becomes increasingly important as we sort of look at our residents' everyday lives and really try to address them. We do have struggles with our county council. We do have issues trying to sort of broker that bridge between what's going on in our coastal areas and what's going on in other areas in West Sussex. We are coastal and rural, and to be honest, sometimes those conversations are tricky because rural areas do have very specific needs and coastal areas have very specific needs, and they can actually be very complementary. But if you don't address them separately, you end up with this sort of homogenous splodge that doesn't do anybody any particular good. So we're really keen on looking at on the South Coast. So I was interested when you said a South Coastal mayor. I was like, well, that sounds interesting. We're very interested on the South Coast about what we're doing across our districts and boroughs and looking at those economies of scale. We obviously have Brighton, our unitary, along to the east of us, but we do have 3 distinct districts that actually are busy doing their own things. But if we amalgamated together, I think we could be so much stronger. But that's a sort of ongoing conversation here, but it definitely has potential. I'm sure it does around the country as well. We have lots of stuff that unites us in the coastal areas. And then, sorry, finally, I'll the institutions. I think sort of, you know, moving on from that coastal South Mayor, we also have lots of anchor institutions here on the coast that give us a very strong sense of place, and we unite around our sort of blue and green issues, I suppose is what you call them. So here we have Sussex Bay, and we also have UNESCO. We have a UNESCO area as well that doesn't quite come across to us, but we have all sorts of opportunities in terms of marine biodiversity that can really regenerate. We talk about the Green New Deal. We also talk about a Blue New Deal here, sort of a blue industrial revolution. And interestingly, talking to other leaders around the country, when we're talking about the Green New Deal and talking about local energy networks, there's a real appetite in local Labour leadership around the country and different councils to say, well, hang on a second, let's not go into competition here. Let's look at the different energy options that we can actually generate as a country to become self-sustaining. And let's, if you like, say, okay, the South takes this particular energy. So, you know, you take wind, we'll take solar, and, you know, we'll take biofuels and hydrogen. And there's a real appetite, talking to people up in Manchester, talking to people on the East Coast, about saying, you know, let's actually consolidate, make sure that we are actually doing our bit and that we become together as a whole. So I do think coastal areas can add a lot to that, not least because we've got a whole load of coastline that can put wind turbines on. So so I think there's a lot to be said for that. So thanks very much, Pam. You totally summed up our issues, and I'm gonna use that going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Becky. As I think I've said before, we will do a clip and clips of the whole of this conference so that people will be able to access, whether it's Pam's presentation, Lord Mandelson's speech, etc., both to share, motivate and encourage. Daniel, can I go over to you for your sort of initial take on Pam's observations?
Lovely, thank you, Huel, and good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, can I say on behalf of the Shadow DEFRA team, I mean, I've been listening to most of the proceedings this morning. A big thank you to all the people who contributed. Really, really important observations. And also thank you to Huel and the Labour Coast and Country team, because you play a really, really vital role. Look, I've been doing the Shadow Fisheries Brief for the last few years now. I'm coming from a non-fishing background and a decidedly non-coastal seat. And the way I decided to do that was basically do the obvious thing, go around and see people. And I found myself in some extraordinarily different places. As Jane Kirkham observed earlier, I've been at Liskeard down in Cornwall. In the week when the great and the good went to Davos, I was at a mackerel processing plant in Peterhead. I think I probably had the better deal, frankly. And round the coast, the thing that strikes me, whether it was Grimsby with Melanie On, who I hope will be returned as the next MP, whether it's down on the east coast looking at small boats at West Mersey, there's a huge range of experiences around the coast. And I suppose the thing, looking at the presentation from Pam, which I thought was really helpful, was I keep coming back to my thought that how local government has been kind of almost destroyed by the Tories over the last 20, 30 years. Because what we're really seeking to do here is re-empower and reinvigorate our local governance. And I'm not sure that, well, certainly from the Shadow DEFRA team, we're not in a position to reform local government. But I think that to me is the biggest message I take from this, that we're going to need different solutions in different places. And the only way you can do that is by having that local understanding and local input. I'm very strongly in favour of the Labour Coast and Country campaigns in terms of parishes and strengthening towns. With no disrespect to mayors, I'm not sure that a proliferation of mayors necessarily sorts out these problems. I think in the end, it's actually about delegating far more authority. A few thoughts on what we're actually here for, which I think is a mixture of winning the election and then thinking about what we do if we get power. Instantly, I would say I thought Peter Mandelson's address this morning was extremely helpful and very thoughtful and sensible. I had the slightly daunting task at the Countryside Conference, which did feel slightly like an away game, I have to say, at Hatfield House, following Peter giving the shadow front bench position. And I think one of the things that we're managing to do at the moment is go out into areas which for a while probably Labour has possibly not felt particularly confident about going into, and actually presenting ourselves in a sensible, serious way. And I think that is actually one of the big things that we are doing, and then empowering Labour supporters who are in those areas. We know wherever you go across the country, is exactly as Peter said, we're a national party. There are Labour people, but equally, as he said, in too many places, the response is, well, we're fed up with the Conservatives, but we're not really sure about you yet. And I think that's, and looking at the candidates on the conference this morning, I'm hugely encouraged, because I think what we're seeing is plausible, credible people who can begin to put that Labour message across. Just a couple of reflections on what we might be saying to people in the different areas. I think it very much depends where you are. I have to say, in the east of England, we've got huge opportunities in terms of offshore production, huge number of potential jobs. I think that is a strong case that we can put to people. We haven't talked much about tourism this morning. I think tourism remains key for the coastal strip, as it does for many of our rural areas too. I think the pollution issues that Jessica raised are very salient in certain places, not all the places, but absolutely top of the political agenda in some. So I think it will depend where you are, what we choose to do. Just on the fishing side, although fishing actually in terms of economic significance is a very small part of our economy, as we know from the Brexit debate, it has a kind of emotional significance, and still I think in many coastal communities it matters. And part of the job I've set myself is just going and listening and trying to appear sympathetic to those communities, because as I say, I think we've got quite a long way to go to actually win them over to voting for us. But what we can do is, I think we can draw the sting of hostility, which I think frankly that there was, particularly around the Brexit time. People feel let down again, despite all the promises that were made, and no great surprise there, of course, to many of us. But I think we're part of that conversation as to what renegotiations might look like in 3 or 4 years' time. I think we've got to be sensible about that. But there are certainly things we can do, particularly with the under 10 metre fleet, which is the vast majority of people, if not a small amount in terms of what is actually caught. Those people are feeling pretty got at the moment by a lot of the bureaucratic processes of organisations like the Maritime and Coastal Agency. And certainly one of the things I've been saying very strongly is that we will try and adopt a more sympathetic attitude. And that actually rings true, I think, to a lot of people in rural areas who are dealing with the bureaucracy, sadly, the Rural Payments Agency, and sometimes in Natural England as well. So partly it's a matter of tone, which I think Peter was talking about, and not picking unnecessary fights with people just because they have a slightly different outlook, perhaps from some of the ones that people hold in seats like mine in Cambridge. I see part of my role as actually a bridge between two very different worlds. And I think actually I'm well placed to do that. And I think that's something that Labour representatives in general should be trying to do, bring people together rather than pull them apart. So I thoroughly welcome all those suggestions from Labour Coast and Country. We'll feed them back into, we've got a relatively new team in the Shadow DEFRA team at the moment. I've been there a while, and I will be feeding those back to colleagues, and very much looking forward to continuing the conversation and dialogue, Huel, with you and your colleagues.
Thank you very much, Daniel. By all means, invite us along to come and make presentations to that team or any of the other front bench teams you think might appreciate what Pam, Ant and others have done here. That'd be fantastic. Dan, thank you again for joining us. Observations from you? Clearly, you've got a slightly different patch to everybody else, but you're a person in power. So it makes a lot of difference.
Well, first of all, Huel, can I thank you for what you do for Coast and Country and all your team, and Alex Mayer for chairing this morning. I saw her doing a fantastic job as Peter gave his presentation. I thought Peter's comments were very interesting. I agreed with most of them. I do think the tone is very, very important about how you make your case and how you sound, the kind of values that you have behind you in the way that you make your case is really important. As the chair of the League Against Cruel Sports, you'll understand that I have a particular view about cruelty in the countryside, but I've always found, both as a rural MP in a past life and currently as a Metro Mayor across a large area, which includes very rural parts and towns and things, that actually cruelty is not accepted anywhere, actually. But you do need to make the case in a skilled way. I accept that completely. Otherwise, it looks like you do have those divisions, which we actually don't. I don't think is the case, fair to say. So look, you'll appreciate that I've come in at very short notice. I'm very happy to do that. I suppose what I'd simply say is that the mayors up and down the country do represent largely urban communities by and large, but they do have coast and rural parts too, of course. And I'm not unusual in having quite a lot of rural communities. And in part, I kind of have links with coastal communities too. Now, what I'd simply say is, from my perspective, if it helps people, is that my combined authority was created initially by 4 unitary authorities, and then one at the very last minute dropped out, and it was the coastal one, the sort of Western-super-Mare, North Somerset area. And that has made things kind of unusual in my area, because although they dropped out, I still have some responsibilities in that unitary authority area that fell out. So I do have some say about things that happen in a coastal community as well as the rural areas around my part. And I suppose my observations would simply be that whether mayors are the right or wrong thing in terms of devolution to help the coast and the country in the future, and I think there is a debate to be had about that, what I can simply say is that whatever rules you have, constitutions, governance rules you have, we need to think about that very carefully, because I found myself in a position where I have huge responsibilities for a whole range of things like transport, skills and training, housing, etc. But in reality, because of the way that devolution has been operated by the Conservative government, they have not given me the governance that allows me to make some difficult decisions, despite having a very large mandate. So basically, the whole of my region in the round is left of centre. But the way it divides up in either local council elections or sometimes parliamentary constituencies makes that more difficult for me, because they were the ones who sort of created the mayoral role, and they didn't want that mayoral role to be too powerful or too dominant from a Conservative perspective. They didn't want Labour very strong in and around Bristol to dominate the rural parts of the wider West of England area. So we need to think about that as a party, what we do in terms of that. And all I'd simply say is we need to have majority voting when combined authorities meet, rather than the unanimous voting that's often required, would you believe, because it always means that effectively every council has a veto, and then you always play to the lowest common denominator. And that's not just bad for my region as it currently stands, it's certainly bad for coast and country communities too, because I think that stops us doing amazing things. The other thing I'd say is I don't think doing single policies anymore as a policy initiative is really the way that we can move forward and make most impact for the Labour Party in terms of changing people's lives for the better, but also in terms of making our party successful in its own right. And perhaps I can explain that a little bit more. I've just introduced something that some of you may have heard about called birthday buses. It's where in the month of a person's birthday, they get free transport, bus travel throughout the whole of the west of England. So that potentially involves 1 million plus people. They can use the bus as many times as they want in their birthday month, go as far as they want, all completely free. And there's several reasons why we've done that. The first one is obvious, that we're trying to encourage people to change behaviour so they get out of their cars and use public transport more. We've staggered it by using birthday months rather than just saying, you know, everybody do it for a month or two, because we don't want people to turn up to use buses having switched out from their car to find the bus is full, and then they're disincentivized forever and a day. So it manages the demand. Everybody remembers their birthday. Well, I say everybody, perhaps 1 or 2% don't. Perhaps Boris Johnson doesn't know his own birthday or something. I don't know, some daft people, I guess. But most people know their birthday. So that helps to make sure that people know when it's their time to get free transport. So it deals with incentivizing behavior change, which is hugely important if you believe there's a climate emergency, as I do, and I'm sure many of you do too. Secondly, it deals with the here and now, which is a terrible cost of living crisis, the toughest that I've ever known in my adult life. So it gives free travel to those who most need it. Where I am, buses are still used predominantly by poorer people. It's not like in London where you get a cross-section of society. It's more classless there. In my area, it is more poorer people use public transport. There's still a stigma about using the bus rather than using other forms of transport. So it does help those who are desperately needing to use buses in the here and now, because they're getting 1/12 slashed off their annual bill for travel immediately. So that's really good. Also, it helps deal with things like pollution. Pollution kills 300 people prematurely in my region every year. It also helps with the economy, because the congestion that is currently caused by too many cars blocking up narrow streets because of the history of our road building in this region, it means that £300 million a year it costs our economy because it isn't moving and flowing. So birthday buses deals with a whole range of policy challenges at once. And I think we'll have to see how birthday buses turns out ultimately when the trial finishes. But I think that is the way that we have to do things, because I think single issue policies are kind of more difficult to really impact in a meaningful and significant way. So I think that's quite important. The interesting thing is that we're finding that people are using birthday buses to travel down to the seaside. So that might be a help to the coastal communities' economies from the big cities. So that's quite useful. Then the other thing I noticed, someone asked a question about modular housing. And can I just say I'm a keen person when it comes to modular housing. I think we've really got to think about this really, really carefully. We have got an aging population. We've got a challenge when it comes to dementia that's coming down the tracks very fast. You know, I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but it's something like 1 in 10 of us in about 20 years' time will either have dementia or have a family member who has dementia or a friend who has dementia. And we need to work out how we're going to handle the care and support for people that are in that situation. And modular housing might be the answer, because if we're building homes that can allow people to stay so they don't have to move, they can make roots in the community and stay. If you can change the layout, if people are not clear what modular housing is, it's where you have the external walls, but you're able to change the layout of the internal parts of the building. So it might be that when you're a young adult, you want bedrooms because you've got children that you want them to be in. Then you get to your middle age, maybe, where your children have grown up, you might want to use some of those rooms as an office because you're working remotely from home. And then as you get older, you may decide that you want a walk-in shower on the ground floor rather than upstairs as you previously had it. But it gives that flexibility. And I do think we need to think about those kind of things, because I think it allows people to stay in their homes for longer. I think that takes the burden off the NHS, as well as provide a better quality of life for individuals living in modular homes. Okay, I think I've probably chatted a long time. I hope you forgive me for meandering a bit, but I came in at very short notice, Huel. And I hope
not meandering at all, Dan.
Fine, well, I hope that's helped your debate.
Definitely.
And it's great to sit down with Simon, as always.
Perhaps at some point we can get the sort of evaluation of that birthday bus proposition, because it sounds like just a fascinating, really different way of looking at meeting a challenge. some of us who are a bit policy orientated might struggle with it, but it's what real people might want for real, the real world experiences. I'm going to stop because I want to make sure that Pam has an opportunity to respond to the great contributions from the three of you. I suspect that might mean we're not going to have much time for questions, but we will pick them up in the chat, and I'll make sure we've got that, and we'll place some of that back in how we present and write up the conference and all the contributions that people have made today. So over to you, Pam, before come back to me to close for the end of the day. Pam.
Okay, thanks, Yul, and thanks everyone for your really interesting contributions. I've been trying to kind of digest it all into a neat thing to say at the end. I think just what Dan was saying at the end about the single issues really resonates across lots of what the other contributions were. Dan talking about Daniel talking about the fishing thing, and do we think of it economically, but then we're missing a whole trick around kind of the cultural and emotional context and community context around fishing. What Becky was saying around the kind of green and the blue, and bringing together these different industrial or nature-based opportunities and challenges, and I see similar in my work as at the port in Plymouth, that we're talking a lot about what's happening with offshore wind, and everyone's very supportive from an environmental perspective about having this kind of transition towards more renewable energy, but not necessarily are we thinking about what the shoreside implications are of that work, and how that might change the landscape and seascape that people are attached to, as well as this social justice element of kind of how the benefits are distributed. So I completely agree, and I think that is something that everybody was coming to, is that one of the things about the coast is it's very fluid and it changes all the time, and I think that makes us, when we're engaging with coastal issues, be a bit more fluid and a bit more integrated, or want to be, and recognise the need to be. But then we come to this barrier of governance and the kind of strict rules and shapes that we have around the governance that were often not really built for those kinds of complicated circumstances that we get at the coast, and that we're seeing more simply because of how things are changing kind of environmentally and economically. So I was also just quickly very interested about the different views around kind of mayors as a potential kind of governance structure there. That's a whole other debate in many ways that we could have, and I think it's important that we look at our governance both in terms of what we're doing politically, but also in the kind of more social focused way about not everything has to be politically partisan. Actually, this might be a controversial thing to say in a Labour Party focused conference, but sometimes the greatest partnerships are cross-party or not party at all related, but are partnerships between different organisations. So when we're thinking about that governance, having a reflection about actually what are the best structures that we need, I think is a really important thing to do.